Which brings us, to the early 1920s. And so the other, Alan and Les will talk more about the details of, the previously acknowledged status of the tribe in the early 1920s and how that was unjustly undone by, kind of one person. But I think in thinking about the kind of historical context for this, there were, if you knew where to look, there was documentation of the Ohlone community broadly in the Bay Area, and in particular of the Muwekma ancestors in the East Bay, which we'll talk about throughout this symposium. And we can see this in census counts, almost certainly undercounted, but known individuals who belong to tribal lineages are in those census records. There are maps that show where people were living. But these kind of prevailing attitudes that the kind of settler society, the dominant society had about Native people in California, right? Kind of going back to the very beginning when I was talking about Native people here were seasonally mobile. They lived in small polities. When they were brought into the missions, they were taken out of their homelands. They were taught Spanish. They were taught agriculture. They, in many cases, picked up the Catholic faith. And so when they came out of the missions, in the context of, genocide, they turned to those skills that they had picked up in the missions, right? They could speak Spanish. They could attend Mass. They could plant. They could, serve as cowboys. They could essentially take on that mestizo identity and protect their families. But what that meant from an anthropological point of view, and, I'm an anthropologist, so I, in thinking about the culpability of our own discipline here, like I said, Kroeber and these early anthropologists weren't interested in that. They weren't interested in the daily lives of people in 1920. What they wanted to know was what life was like, this quote-unquote pristine indigenous cultures, which is itself very problematic, right? It's very essentializing. Native people have lived here in the state for 15,000 years and probably more, essentially since time immemorial. To think that they were exactly the same for that whole time period is ridiculous. But at that time in anthropology, that was what they were looking for, right? Was this pure essence of what it meant to be a California Indian. So they didn't see the people in their own backyards. They didn't see Muwekma's ancestors living around Pleasanton and Sunol and Niles. And the same thing for the government, right? This is kind of these two institutions had this symbiotic relationship. If you think back even into the 1870s and 80s, the way the government kind of worked with and against Native people went hand in hand with anthropology, the growth of anthropology as a discipline. So it's no surprise then that the groups that anthropologists didn't see as, authentically Native, the government did either. So that's kind of the historic context for erasure. But I also want to talk about resistance. Well, first let me just say that, that in thinking about this context for the erasure, it puts Native people here in the Bay Area, it puts the Muwekma Ohlone Tribe in what we might think of as a double bind. It's a double form of coloniality, right? The government, in a sense, is saying, because your ancestors suffered so much, because they had to do what they had to do to survive, you are no longer truly who you are, right? And I think that's kind of, obviously, politically that's, their position, the government's position. But if we think about it from a moral standpoint, that's really challenging to think through. That, some people could have suffered, a group of people and their ancestors and their lineages could have suffered so tremendously because of what happened at places like Santa Clara here in our own community today. And because of that, we're going to punish them further. So I think, that's something that we need to think through as, for us that work and live here as a campus, but certainly, as a Bay Area, as a community. And last week, we had an environmental justice conference here on campus, and we had Chairman Valentin Lopez of the Amamutsan, which is the tribe just to the south of us. And one of the things he said was that the perpetrators need to heal just as much as tribal communities, and if not more. And I think that's true at Santa Clara, and I think that this symposium is a great step in that direction. We need to own up to what institutions like this have been responsible for in the past. So I think there's a lot of truth in that. But I think in the focus on loss, right, there's a risk there. And that's the same risk that we can see repeated in these patterns that I've just been talking about. If we focus on the loss of life, right, the missions were truly disastrous for Native people in terms of just, the tremendous loss of life. If we focus on the loss of land, if we focus on the loss of culture, then that's just buying or playing into the politics of erasure that we see and that other speakers will talk about. And so I think you need to acknowledge that harm that was done, and places like Santa Clara have a lot to think through as a community, but we also need to focus on how people resisted that in the past and into the present, just to kind of provide that context of, there was loss, but people didn't give up. And so that's kind of the second part of my talk today. And so how can we see how the ancestors of the Muwekma Ohlone and other Native groups in California, how did they cope with this? How did they cope with being relocated into these missions? How did they cope with the loss of life? How did they deal with the pressures of the early American period? And I think, again, this kind of gets to the chairwoman's point about if we only focus on that period between 1927 and the early 1980s, we're missing this broader trajectory of how people made do, how they kept their communities alive. And I think that's really critical. All right. So the first thing is, like I said, I'm an anthropologist and I'm an archaeologist. And I think, over the last couple of decades, there's been a tremendous amount of archaeological work here on our campus with the Mission San Jose, other missions in the area, Mission San Juan Bautista, Mission Santa Cruz. We've got colleagues working down there. And just what we know historically, but also archaeologically about how Native people lived in the missions has really changed dramatically in the last 20, 25 years. And, in the slide there, I use the term rancheria, and that just means the Native neighborhood at a particular mission. That was kind of the colloquial term for it. But there's been lots of excavations now. In the old days when people did archaeology at missions, it was kind of in the service of reconstructing the churches or something, other architecture. But there's really been a radical reorientation to try to find out, well, how did Native people live? What kinds of things did they do in their own backyards or in their own homes? And that's where we really see how people kept tradition alive despite the challenges of the time. So, I don't want to go into all the weeds of the archaeology, but, we see things now that, like tobacco, for instance. One of the digs I did here on campus, we found thousands and thousands of tobacco seeds. And of course, tobacco was sacred for Native people. They used it in their rituals. And so we can see that people kept their rituals alive. There's also a raptor talon. I believe it's a golden eagle talon there on the slide. People, we know in pre-contact times, people would raise eagles to use their feathers for regalia. And it seems that either they were hunting eagles or perhaps even raising them here in the mission as well. We see their bones and in this case, a talon. We see shell beads, which were literally money. In the image in the middle, it might be too small to see, but this is an image that was drawn in 1816 at Mission Dolores up in San Francisco, and it shows Native people gaming. And they're in the person seated kind of on your left. In front of him, coiled up, is a whole thing of shell beads. And we know people use beads essentially as a currency here in California. And so we see these all over in the mission context. So there's so much we can learn about how Native people kept their cultures alive in the missions by kind of critically rereading the documents and looking at the archaeology. And we also know that despite the tremendous demographic challenges that people faced in the missions, as I showed before, the deaths outpacing births by a long shot in any given year, but we know that people intentionally tried to keep their communities alive. And we can see this in the mission records. The missionaries recorded, for all their faults, they were great record keepers. They recorded every individual's baptism. If they got married, they recorded their marriage, and ultimately their burial. And when we look at the mission records, there's a lot we can piece together about how communities intentionally thought about how they were going to replicate the next generation. And we know, through various sources, kind of how intermarriage worked in pre-contact times and pre-colonial times, and we see those patterns continue in the missions. Here at Santa Clara, Ohlone people from different tribal communities intermarried, and over time, as more and more people from outside Santa Clara Valley were recruited to this mission, Yokuts and Miwok people, or speaking people from the Central Valley, those folks often intermarried into existing Ohlone lineages. And so we can kind of see these core early lineages at the Bay Area missions intentionally taking in new people, often kind of solidifying alliances between high-status families, and so on. And we can kind of piece together how they kept their communities going in spite of the tragic losses. We can also use those same records to see how people maintain connections to their homelands, right? So I was kind of talking at the beginning about those the process of reduction, of literally reducing Native communities into the missions, and how some anthropologists have taken that to mean that there was no autonomous Native communities after about 1810 here in the Bay Area. But we can see in the death records here at Santa Clara, about 9% of Native people who are listed in the death records actually died, and in many cases were buried in their home villages. So they found ways to escape, either just literally as fugitives, sometimes manipulating a pass system that the missionaries allowed them to go back to their homelands. So we know, just by proxy, that there were communities out there who were never enumerated in any colonial documents. And of course, again, with the archaeology, we can link obsidian. It's a volcanic glass that's used for manufacturing stone tools, and we can use different geochemical methods to determine exactly where those stones were picked up on the landscape to produce these tools that were used here in the missions. Similar things can be done with beads. We can infer trade networks that crossed the entire state. So we know people here at Santa Clara, at San Jose, at the different missions that the tribe's ancestors were a part of. We know that they were keeping connections up with people outside of the mission communities, keeping connections to their homelands.